So we're going to start. I've been trained recently by Denise Rodriguez, who's been chairing board meetings here. She starts at the time we're supposed to start, whether anyone is there or not. It's an interesting exercise. So thank you for coming. I imagine more folks will drift in. So this is part of a series that we're doing once a month on the labor movement and so we started with the labor movement and Me Too, and then we did the labor movement and environmentalism, and then we did the labor movement and Black Lives Matter. Next month it will be the labor movement and healthcare reform. And the idea really grew out of the summer book club here that was very moved by Elizabeth Fow's new book, Rethinking the Labor Movement, and really challenging us to think about the relationship between the labor movement and other social movements. So we wanted to look tonight at the labor movement and the campaign for 15 Now. And I think what both sides of that relationship can learn from each other. And I'm delighted that people took time out of busy schedules to be with us. So we have Kera Peterson from the St. Paul Regional Labor Federation, Rick Varco from SEIU, Beth Blick, who's an activist on behalf of workers with disabilities, Geoff Paquette from HERE Local 17, Thiele from Teamsters Local 320, and Hedges, who is one of these guys who is supposedly retired. And clearly his legacy will be that all workers at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport will be organized before Kip is actually ready to retire. So I think that what we'll just do is we'll start with Kera, because here she is. No?
I don't think.
Do you want to?
Kip.
Yeah, I
start with Kip. Okay.
I would say Kip. It probably makes sense.
Let's start down there.
We'll start with Kip, because Kip was really the first advocate for 15 Now, and then I'm going to let you guys fight it out the rest of the way. And I've asked them to keep it to 10 minutes, and I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time and give you this from the back. And Carla is Facebook live streaming this, so people who decided not to venture out tonight but would like to see what's happening will be watching. Okay, Kip.
So I will. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll give you a very brief history, which I think will be instructive about the movement for 15 in the Twin Cities, and then move on to some of what Peter was talking about, although they're closely related. In 2014, a group of workers at the airport decided that they would push the Metropolitan Airport Commission to adopt a $15 an hour minimum wage ordinance. And that was largely based on the success of airport workers in Seattle to win a 15 minimum wage, and then the city of Seattle. So those victories kind of spurred on workers at MSP. We tore it up. I mean, we had thousands of workers sign a petition asking the MAC to increase the wage. We had 100, 150 workers at each of the MAC meetings protesting, asking them to move on it. I was fired as a result of it, and certainly not because of me getting fired, but it certainly poured gasoline onto the fire. We had 500 people in front of the terminal on December 5th, 2014, took over the airport roadway, shut down the airport for a couple of hours. All of this gathered Governor Dayton's attention, and we ended up winning a $1 above the state minimum wage increase. When we first started out with this, when myself and others went to the unions, we went to the Minneapolis Regional Labor Federation, that was the president of the MRLF at that time is now the state Fed president, Bill McCarthy. He was not interested. We went to UFCW, what's the one in Minneapolis, 658? Whatever it is. And a couple of years later, talking to the president of that UFCW local, he said, when you came and talked to me about 15, I thought you were from Mars. And that local, in fact, now is one of the most advanced in terms of using 15 as an organizing tool, being supportive, doing lots of organizing, and going from being kind of the heart of darkness of the labor movement to one of the brighter lights. And 15 played an important part of that. So it was the fight at the airport by airport workers that kind of cracked open the door to the labor movement, which then in turn cracked open the door to Minneapolis and St. Paul. And now, 4 years later, we're coming back around and expect that by May, we'll have a $15 minimum wage ordinance from the MAC, who now are falling all over themselves to support such an ordinance. And it'll be on a quicker timeline than either Minneapolis or St. Paul, because small businesses really aren't a factor at the airport. So that's the brief history. I was reading a thing yesterday about how Trump has now appointed one of the leaders of the Associated Building Contractors, ABC, which is a brutally anti-union construction lobby outfit, whatever you want to call them. And are constantly trying to figure out ways to attack prevailing wage, to attack construction unions and construction workers. And as I was reading this, I was thinking that they are sharpening their knives to take down the building trades unions. It's just way too expensive, and they're working 24 hours a day to undermine building trades unions. There's a big problem for the building trades unions, which is they have not been involved in any way in the fight for 15, in the fight for affordable housing. They've been fighting for any kind of building, luxury apartments mostly. And they really, because of their skill, they feel that they can rely on that to protect themselves, and don't feel the need to, they don't understand the question of solidarity with community, solidarity with communities of color, solidarity with the fight against racism and sexism, fights around the environment, and fights for 15. They have stood back from the fight for 15. And that sets them up for disaster. That's going to have to change. If building trades unions are going to survive, they will have to change in a dramatic way to reach out to allies. And the same is true, that's just the most dramatic example of the need for social movement unionism. And that's really at the heart, I mean, that's kind of a fancy term, but what it really means is that unions in this day and age, and certainly it's been true forever, the unions made the biggest gains in the 30s and the 40s, because they were fighting for Social Security, unemployment insurance, child or labor laws. Earlier it was child labor, 8-hour day, etc. And for quite a period of time, we, because I'm complicit in this as a longtime union member and union president, etc., have lost our way in terms of reaching out to our natural allies and understanding in a fundamental way the question of solidarity. So that's one of the reasons, besides the fact that poverty amongst working class people is incredibly destabilizing for society, that it's vicious, that it destroys children's lives, etc. It's a question of class survival to take up questions like 15 now, or 15 minimum wage, I should say. I was active with 15 now. So I think that I'm probably not at 10 minutes yet, but I am going to stop talking and let other people say what they have to say, and then I think during the discussion we can dig into this a lot more. But it's not, I mean, there were some people who became involved in the fight for 15 because they wanted to do something nice, which is good. And they wanted to help poor people, that's a noble instinct, but it goes way deeper than that. And I think other speakers can get into the fact that what transpired in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and at the airport, these are real class battles between very powerful rich people and unions and working class people. And the forces that try to put a tip penalty into both Minneapolis and St. Paul, that try to just whittle away and chop down whatever they could to weaken the ordinances, were very serious, well organized, and it did take a mobilization of unions, particularly in St. Paul, to stop what they were trying to do.
So I'm Thiele. Whoa, this is equity. I feel like Cher. I'm the organizer for Teamsters Local 320. We're a statewide local. I have kind of the opposite story to Kip in that I came to the labor movement and the fight for 15 at the exact same time very recently. I'm going to tell you a little about myself because as an organizer I never get to do that. I moved here to Minnesota from California where I went to college and worked retail for minimum wage. I moved here to work at my uncle's restaurant. Don't ever do that. I found out after I got here that my uncle is famous for not paying his workers and I was no exception, so I actually lost money at that job. And then I was back working retail. So when I got a union job at the University of Minnesota, I felt like I had won the lottery. Not only was I getting $12 whole an hour, I was working a set 40-hour schedule, not changing every week and worrying about getting coverage. And when my union card came in the mail, my mother, with whom I was living, opened it and put it in front of me and said that if I didn't sign it, I wasn't invited to Christmas. I was gonna sign it anyway. I realized working that job for what I thought was a lot of money that I was never gonna be able to catch up. I was already in crushing debt from working for so little for so long. So when I was invited to my first union action, I actually had no idea what it was. I was just told to be at Northrop at the University of Minnesota on February 15th, and I got there, and if any of you are transplants to Minnesota, you might have heard that it's actually really hard to make friends with all these nice Minnesotans. And so for the first time, I felt this amazing sense of community, and people were talking about struggling to pay their bills, which is something I felt. People were talking about poverty, which is something I felt. Lizzo was performing on the back of a truck. I mean, who would ever want to leave a movement like that? So I never did. And a few years later, I got a job with the local. So I came from being very excited and into the fight for 15. Well, I got involved, I got to meet Kip and a lot of other great people. After doing that, I got to see what Kip was talking about, the dark underbelly of labor bureaucracy, I think is the term he used. People now, assuming that I would agree with them, I think, came to me and said, we shouldn't be doing this $15 minimum wage. This is a waste of time. We should be worrying about getting $15 for our dues-paying members and negotiating $15 into our contracts. What people like that can't ever understand is really the solidarity that you can feel with a big group of diverse people from different jobs, all fighting for the same thing. I was thinking about a metaphor that doesn't involve drugs or alcohol, and I couldn't come up with one. So I'll say, it's like you've been drinking Michelob Golden Light for a long time, and you think you're a heavy drinker and can handle your alcohol, and then you're drinking straight moonshine. Labor bureaucracy is your Michelob Golden Light, and it's sometimes effective, but deeply flawed, and it really ignores the power of working people. When you get into something like a $15 minimum wage fight, it's so much bigger than just your contract and your members and dropping cards and hoping people sign them. It's about real organizing, deep organizing, and the scariest thing to labor bureaucrats often, it's about showing people that they have power collectively. And I think it's unfortunate, but there are leaders in the labor movement who would like to avoid that if possible. So to me, the $15 minimum wage movement and other related movements, broad social movements that the labor community can get behind, are so much more powerful than just one contract and one group of people. And I'm really proud to have been involved in it, and I can't wait to keep up the fight. The University of Minnesota still doesn't have a $15 minimum wage, so keep that in mind. And that's all I got.
So my name is Geoff Paquette. I'm an organizer with Unite Here Local 17, which is the hotel workers union in the Twin Cities here. And so I've been with our union for 12 years or so, and I got involved with unions and with the labor movement, not because I'm particularly excited about hotel workers, or I think that they're going to be the industry that shuts down and really is able to seize the means of production from the capitalist. But I was a student organizer at school, and I got involved with the living wage campaign on campus. And when I graduated, I was super excited about continuing the labor movement. Unite Here was one of the few unions that had a program to train organizers by people intentionally getting jobs in hotels that we're trying to organize, and then therefore being a SALT or being an organizer on the inside. And so I believe in the labor movement as a source for change. I think that I was fortunate enough to study abroad in other countries where the labor movements were these pillars of resistance with social movements. And so I was in Central America, for example, when the Costa Ricans were struggling against CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement. And the University Workers Union was this organization that had money and resources to provide the speakers with which the students were giving rallies and the trucks with which they were able to block highways. And that was a turning point in my life to realize that the labor movement can be this vehicle for immense change and has to be supportive of social movements. And so I first came upon Fight for 15 by the name of Fight for 15. So like the SEIU funded nonprofit or kind of front group that was just pushing the $15 minimum wage as a as a topic, and that was in Florida when I came in contact with it. And I didn't think I don't think that's particularly effective to like organize fast food workers and do kind of minority strikes to win, but I think what it did do, and our union in Central Florida was supportive of whenever they had rallies and whenever they were doing minority strikes, whatever they were doing, because I think it is important there's something about bringing the repetitive nature of $15 minimum wage, that it brings it so that it's not, it doesn't sound like someone's from Mars when they talk about it, right? And so I think, so I'm representing a local that for the last 15, 20 years has been completely isolated and has been a union that has been only looking out for their members. I bet that when KIP approached Local 17 however many years ago about the airport stuff, which we have about 1,000 plus workers doing all of the food, I'm sure that what happened.
It wasn't pretty.
Yeah, I'm sure that's not kind of what you just said. But I mean, so when the new leadership of the union that I work for now ran against the entrenched leadership a year and a half ago, that was the opportunity for me and my wife to come back to Minnesota to be close to our family, because we were not going to work for union leaders that were focused on isolating themselves from the rest of the movement. So I was able to come to the very trail end of the 15 passing in St. Paul, and we tried, and I think some of our leaders in St. Paul were very vocal and outspoken as tipped workers against the tipped penalty, which I think is great, but that's totally a testament to them and being strong women and strong leaders in our union for a period of time. And so I think that this is why I work for unions, but I do believe that like when you have fights in your work life, that doesn't just stay there, and it bleeds out to the rest of the fights that you could have as a person. So there were some awesome tip workers that were involved, and I was supportive of the $15 passing, of course, but it was well on its way. And I think it's incredible the work that Kip and everyone else that is panel has done. So I'm proud to kind of to be a very, very, very small part of it. I think that towards the end.
The other microphone.
Oh, yeah. Which one do you want? You have your
Should I?
choice.
You want to go? Or that might.
Yeah.
I'll go. Yeah, I too had been involved with 15 Now. I came all the way, literally all the way from St. Paul, to help, in my actions with, oh, it isn't? Where is it? Oh, here. Here, I, literally came all the way from Minneapolis in my activism with 15 Now to help pass it in Minneapolis. And I, was also dreaming and hoping that the same thing could be done in St. Paul, as a troublemaker. And it finally happened. But I also kept wondering why the hell disability was not being included, because disabled people are poorer than non-disabled people. And when the minimum wage was being passed in, I can't even remember what year it was by the state legislature, the so-called sheltered workshops put the pressure on the powers that be to say no, to keep those of us, although I used to work in some of those a long time ago, those who are still working in them, excluded. And a part of that involves being from a group that you're trying to correct and be like everybody else, and that's just so wrong. And in these horrible places, you're being made to work lesser than the minimum wage, and the only place, the state that I can think of where that's no longer being done is in Vermont, and it would be interesting to know how that got done, you know, whether it was labor or not, or what have you. So here in St. Paul, I know that, you know, in the Highland Villager, I read that, you know, when I read that was going on as far as the city council letting themselves be pressured into that, you know, I was really outraged. I was outraged, and I wanted to be there to say no to that, but I asked someone from the Teamsters who already are on board against ableism, and I said, I'm not going to be able to be there. I have another commitment that evening, and it still didn't work at all. And then I keep thinking of a paper by Access Press where they have a lot of advertisements from sheltered workshops, and I find it so hypocritical. To me, you know, I will say that as a Jew, it is like having a Jewish newspaper put in ads from organizations that are anti-Semitic. I just cannot stand the hypocrisy. And I'm not afraid and ashamed to speak out when I need to speak out. So anyway, you know, I think that, you know, that people with disabilities in these places deserve a better wage until these places are done away with, you know, and until, you know, they, you know, get better and real jobs. So, you know, I think that, you know, when this does happen, we need to protest in the same way that we do against racism, homophobia, and sexism. And we also need to include ageism. Do I have any more time?
Sure.
Okay. And, you know, and when we don't do that, then we're being complicit. And as they say, silence is complicity. And I think that too often we play the game too damn much of who's more oppressed than whom. And it becomes a game. And you know, where, you know, it becomes what I call a game of popularity. And I, you know, have had to get out of organizations that do that to me. And it makes me just break down and cry. And I just, you know, a few weeks ago I found some literature from one organization that I had to recycle because of that. And, you know, as I go through stuff before I move, I found some more that I wasn't ashamed to do that with. And that was the end of that. And it's always a constant struggle to find groups that, you know, I don't have to be ashamed of to say that I'm out and disabled, and I'm proud of it. So, you know, I think that we need to protest when wages are low for people with disabilities, and also within places that are not sheltered workshops. You know, often we talk about women who were paid low wages to every male dollar. Well, why don't we also include the women who are disabled as well, on the other hand? We need to do that too. And, you know, we also need to do that too if we look at how many strikes, other strikes they may have against them. You know, and speak out against it in our circle, in our other circles or other groups that we hang around with. You know, and say that this just isn't okay. And, you know, and I, you know what it's like to have gone through that, because I have never been in a union in my life. I am in a group home partly because I was abused by a roommate, and I know how to be resourceful. I am getting help to get back on into St. Paul within the next 2 or so months. And to get help, hopefully, you know, if, you know, with the minimum wage going up to 15, it may help with being in a job that is union.
Can we move it on then, Beth?
Yeah.
I just want to say that for somebody who's never been in a union, I think I've walked on more picket lines with you than anybody else I know.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I talked longer.
No. You've earned it.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
So my name is Rick Varco. I'm the political director of SEIU Healthcare Minnesota. I've been there for about 17 years. We're a union of healthcare workers. We represent service and maintenance workers in hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, and then we've got a large unit of self-directed home care workers, people who do in-home care for the elderly and disabled. The theme of the evening is sort of the labor movement as an institution and social movements, sort of with referring back to what Kip said. My first experience of the sort of $15 minimum wage was the struggle in New York, which is the first time I heard of it. And I think that really illustrates the theme of the evening. It was a group of grassroots fast food workers who were really engaged with this, what at the time was this outrageous demand for $15 an hour. But crucially, there was an alliance between them and SEIU, the version of my union in New York, a very large, very powerful union in New York. And I think that struggle has sort of illustrates a recurring theme in a lot of the way this issue has evolved, which is you need both. Social movements drive change. You can't have really profound social change without strong grassroots social movements. But social movements are by their nature, effervescent, and there's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of energy. But what institutional power or institutions bring is power, and the key that I think this struggle illustrates is the taking of that social pressure and that social movement and putting it into institutions to give people who are not the kind of person who's going to come out to a rally, not the kind of person who's going to be a union activist, the ability just to look at their paycheck and be like, hey, I got shorted and I got to go to the city to get my employer to pay me what I am owed. the kind of person who isn't part of those big social movements, who can just say and make it much easier in their life to get that $15 wage because it's an ordinance in the city. And I think the lesson to look for and the lesson to try to learn is how can we use social movements to create institutions of power, both a union, but also in the law books that allow everybody access to something, a benefit like a $15 minimum wage. You know, I first saw this in Minnesota. It was Ty Moore running for city council in Minneapolis, who sort of, I think, first raised the issue of a $15 minimum wage, and my union sort of went very far outside of what I would call our comfort zone, and we actually endorsed him, even though he wasn't the DFL endorsed candidate, even though there was a DFL endorsed candidate running. We didn't win that race, but I think we brought the issue forward, and I think over the next 3 years, the Minneapolis City Council and the mayor really dug in on the issue, and by the end of that sort of 4-year term, they had passed a minimum wage ordinance in Minneapolis, and I think that was some key momentum to getting it in St. Paul. In St. Paul, I think the first thing that sort of, there was the beginnings of this grassroots social pressure. I think where you saw the change was as the mayor's race kicked off. We had a variety of strong candidates. And what I think was distinctive about St. Paul and about the relationship between institutional powers like the DFL, organized labor, unions, and grassroots social movements was the fact that all of the candidates were supporters of 15. Now, we will all talk about how strong they were, how strong the commitment was, but one of Mayor Carter's, after he got elected, one of his strongest talking points in favor of moving forward on 15 was, this is what 97, 99% of the city voted for. And so I think it was really important. I want to give due credit to a candidate like Pat Harris, who was running with the building trades endorsement, but he was a supporter of 15. And that, I think, was a crucial hurdle we got over. Bruce and I probably go back to the days when, if this had been the days of Randy Kelly and Norm Coleman, we would probably have a St. Paul mayoral candidate running against the $15 minimum wage openly. That did not happen, and I think that's because there have been, institutional changes. I think there is a variety of enthusiasm for 15 across the labor movement, but I think everybody recognizes that raising the floor for everybody helps everybody, whether you're in a union or not. And people will vary to the degree to which they sort of talk about it enthusiastically, but I think there is a recognition that we all have an interest in that, locking in that institutional power for all workers to lift themselves up. And, I think that influenced the fact that there was no appetite. Nobody saw a path to power running against 15 in St. Paul. And I think that is a change. I think the other inflection point where this became an issue was after Mayor Carter was elected. There was this real sort of very strong grassroots pressure to do this right away, to do this now. He's just been elected by this big victory, and I think that ran into sort of the St. Paul process. We love our process in St. Paul, and I will say it was important. That process was important for getting a lot of institutional buy-in or institutional neutrality across the city. And while it was frustrating at times, and people felt like there was the danger of losing the grassroots momentum and the grassroots energy. It also had advantages that it allowed us to get a strong ordinance, I think. And I think that's something, you know, people are going to want to look at going forward. How do you balance the need to maintain grassroots energy and momentum versus the need to engage in what can be an often cumbersome process of getting various groups who all have very sort of serious interest in what happens engaged in the process. Which brings us, I think, to the Citizens League process. The city sort of, their process was to have the Citizens League convene a panel. I was one of the co-chairs along with the head of the Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank them for doing a really good job. I think it was, we got an amazing level of buy-in. We had to do 14 weeks of like 3-hour meetings every week, and for people who know how I feel about long meetings, that was a struggle. But I think they managed through this really great education process to get a lot of people in, a lot of the people who might have been institutional opponents of this to either be neutral or supportive. Finally, just moving on to the council, again, there was this, you know, there was the tension between institutional support, institutional needs, and the grassroots. I'll just say the happiest day in my sort of experience of this was the day I found out Chris Tolbert, the Ward 3 City Council member, was going to be the chief author, because he was the person right at that focal point. He's a union member, AFSCME member. He understands union politics and the grassroots energy, but he is also sort of, he has got a small business constituency. He has got a constituency of people who are, let's say, are not grassroots 15 activists. And he managed to, I think, balance those things and move the ordinance forward. I'm not going to bore you with the sort of ins and outs of the sort of, all of the sort of, are we going to face this amendment or that amendment? I will just say I want to give a lot of credit to the grassroots activists. At every point we won the turnout war. I think at every point where there was a big event or a listening session, the people, the restaurant workers, the Thiele folks, the Isaiah folks, yes. Sometimes on short notice, there was never, my fear was there was going to be some community input meeting and it would be 10-to-1, small business opponents, concerned citizens saying, this is going to mess up my local coffee shop, this is going to mess up this little nonprofit program that I really love. And that just never happened. We were always even, or, you know, about even with them. And I think that really meant that then the debate was, what's the good policy? And we had a lot of friends on the city council who agreed with us on the policy. And what, you know, and so I think that was the path to victory. Unfinished business, we've got to get 15 at the airport, and we represent home care workers. We are trying to get them a contract that has 15. We are moving forward to $13.25 over the next 2 years, which will be enough to keep ahead of the Minneapolis minimum wage, but we will keep up that struggle. And then just to circle back to New York and social movements, I think the federal government is never going to be the friend of the labor movement until we abolish the U.S. Senate, but that's a pet peeve of mine. I think the next step, if you look back to New York, they're doing some really interesting things around taking on at-will employment. The basic fact is if you don't have a union in America, you can be fired for any reason, anytime, for any reason. And I think New York is starting to look at a municipal ordinance around at-will employment. I think if we can do things around requiring written contracts between employers and workers, that is not a collectively bargained contract, so we don't preempt federal law and we don't have to worry about the feds being upset. But if it's an individual contract between a worker and their employer, and it says something like, you have to pay them the amount of money you say they're going to pay them. You have to give them a certain schedule. It can be totally negotiated between the employer and the worker, but we have a written contract, and then this would be the leap to institutional power. If the worker could choose whoever they want to enforce that contract and file a grievance in that contract, there could be a way for a grassroots movement of engaged workers to begin to build an institutional power more than they have through. The problem with federal labor law and unions is it's all or nothing. You get that, you know, like your family said, it's like it's like winning the lottery. You get the good job with the good benefits and the good schedule, and there's no way until you go through this elaborate process of getting 50% plus one on board, negotiating a contract. There's no way to get that if you're just a worker or two workers or three workers. So if we can think creatively about the ways to create institutional power for workers, I think we will be able to harmonize the sort of social movement energy and the institutional power.
Following Rick is always a treat. So my name is Kera Peterson. I'm the political director and campaigns manager for the St. Paul Regional Labor Federation. I've worked there for 13 years now. And I don't remember when Kip first came to the Machinist Union and asked us about signing on to 15, but I know it was a little while back. And I think that he walked into the room, he talked with us for a few minutes, and our folks said, yeah, we're on board. I hope that when he came and sat down with folks at the Regional Labor Federation, he felt like he had a similar response. We were really proud to host Kip and Celeste during the course of the St. Paul campaign. And I'm thinking that I had my first meeting with Kip, and I think Claire was there here at the Freedom Library, I want to say back in January, February of 2017. So right around the time that the St. Paul mayoral campaigns were kicking off and really starting to talk about this issue, these fine folks were also working to set the foundation moving their campaign in St. Paul in a more public way. So I would say for folks in the room who don't know, the St. Paul Regional Labor Federation, if you think about us like an umbrella organization, so there are public sector unions, industrial manufacturing unions, building trades unions, who all come together to hopefully find common cause for organizing around policy and political work, and in support of different issues in the community. Sometimes we find a lot more common ground than others. And I'll just leave it at that. But this was a campaign that we were really proud to work on. And I'll say one of the things that we tried to do from the RLF was to help stitch together a bigger quilt in terms of community partners and unions that were working on the campaign. So I know I had early on talked with Kip, and quickly, we said, okay, these are some of the unions that we should try to reach out to, and some of the players that we should try to bring on board, and try to do similar things with some of the nonprofits that we've done policy work with in St. Paul on other things. So I would say, as folks on the panel have said, sometimes working with institutions can be a challenge, but we also, because we're the Federation, we've been active in St. Paul for a very long time, we have a lot of relationships, and some of them might be great, and some of them might need a little improvement. We're always open to that possibility, but we only get stronger by moving ourselves out of our comfort zone, trying to engage with new partners, And I would say this campaign was interesting for me to be a part of, and I'll say in comparison to the St. Safe Time campaign that we had worked on just not too long before. Because on that one, it seemed like most of the partners that were at the table had a pretty keen understanding of how you might move a policy through the city, you know, and they had similar assessments of how things might work out. But this campaign was kind of fun and different because there were new groups at the table who hadn't done who maybe had done a lot of policy work before, but not in the city of St. Paul, or who maybe were newer to policy work. And were really learning as they went. And so at the RLF and a number of our unions had strong relationships that they could help build bridges, try to open doors for people. And I know sometimes it was probably frustrating for Kip and Celeste. They'd come to the meeting at the RLF and we'd sit down and we'd have our every other week meeting where we'd be talking about you know, what do we think is the best way to approach this particular issue? And it might have sometimes seemed like the unions were saying, you know, community partners might have said, this is what we think is going to work, and we might have said, oh no, we think that's a really bad idea. That might have happened more than once. But I think, you know, we also were coming at it from different ways, and I think Rick talked a little bit about this. You know, how people's passion and energy, and you want to give that like as much space as it can take. But we also know from having those long-term relationships with some of these elected officials, maybe how much risk they're willing to bear, or how much confrontation they're willing to accept, right, before they get their hackles up a little bit. So I think for me, it was a real joy to work with folks who pushed me to think about things differently, and to get to work with, to learn from folks who are organizing in different ways. Having worked for the RLF for as long as I have, you kind of get used to organizing certain ways and thinking about things in certain ways, and so it's refreshing to get kind of tossed into like an apple basket and shaken up and all being working together. So I don't know, that's kind of my thoughts. And challenges or next steps. Certainly there are things that we can refine around 15, but I would say one of the, you know, some of the things that I'm excited about is, so we have St. Safe Time policies in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth, and now the state legislature is looking at that. The state legislature is looking at things like paid family and medical leave again, looking at wage theft again, and knowing that these are things that if we haven't worked on them locally, we can be working on them locally to help make a stronger foundation for the folks at the Capitol. I feel like they're obviously more willing to pick up a fight if they know that folks have done some organizing throughout the state to lend some strength to their cause. That's kind of where I'm at, I think.
Thank you.
Sure.
So since somebody has to call on speakers, I'm going to take the microphone. Questions, comments, stories you want to add, things you want to hear more about. Christy, please. Maybe if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Christy Wright. I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I was involved in the Minneapolis campaign for 15.
This is as much so that the camera can pick up your voice.
Oh, okay. I'll start over. So I'm Christy Wright. I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I'm also a graduate student worker. I teach, and I also studied the Fight for 15 as part of my research. But to the panel, you all may have seen that Illinois passed a $15 minimum wage this week. Workers, union activists there have been fighting since 2012, since the movement started. Chicago passed raising the minimum wage back in 2015 or 2016. Now they have 15 for the whole state. And it's wonderful that we passed 15 in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and soon to be the airport. But there are a whole lot of workers in Minnesota who live outside the cities and who don't work at the airport. So I would ask the panelists, what do you think it would take to win 15 for the whole state of Minnesota? And specifically, what can labor do to make that possible?
Easy question. Who wants to start? Rick, please.
Well, that's not going to
work. Jesus.
I got a lot of wood, not that loud. All right. The question was about what would it take to pass 15 at the state level. Well, the last time we raised the minimum wage in Minnesota, we had a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. So I think it's possible under the current circumstances, but not necessarily, not likely. So we're going to need an election where we have supporters like that. I will say the advantage of indexing is we will get to 15 eventually. It's just going to take a lot longer, and I think we'd like to get there faster. I think one thing we can do is, I mentioned it earlier, is sort of, I think 2 achievable down payments on 15 statewide in the near future are, one, the airport, where there are thousands of workers, and then I mentioned earlier we were working on a contract for home care workers, and that's like $25,000 in our bargaining unit, and probably another $25,000 who would get a similar rate increase because of Medicaid. So that would be a pretty big down payment on these things. And then
that would be statewide.
And that would be statewide. I think and I would just follow up on what Kara said, I think one of the things we need to keep the momentum is to move these local ordinances on earned safe and sick time and 15 into the suburbs. I know there's some work going on in Bloomington. Obviously the Mall of America is both an opportunity and a challenge. You know, clearly there's been a lot of progressive political energy in not just the first ring suburbs, but the second and third tier suburbs, and I think that may be a route for interested organizers to move the state discussion forward.
Anyone else? Kip, please. This all the one?
Use this one.
Yeah.
I think Rick's right on the money with that assessment. I think that a victory in a city like Bloomington, it will be war. I mean, you think that 15 oh God, I don't even know if that's, like, is it really that big a deal anymore? In 2012, it seemed like a really radical demand and unachievable. In 2019, it seems like we should really be talking about a lot more than that. The fact of the matter, though, is that to achieve 15 in Bloomington would take a very substantial mobilization, because it's clear that the Minnesota Restaurant Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the Minnesota Business Partnership, etc., they are not done with fighting. And so I know that the the Minneapolis Regional Labor Federation is starting to try and line up the pieces to win in Bloomington, but I think that would really push things forward. Or, I mean, I know SEIU is sort of thinking about possibly Rochester, maybe Duluth, and those would be other likely cities where you have quite a few union members, you have some strong unions, you have some connections with community groups, because that's really that's the coalition that it takes. And then, if all that was done, then you would see Walls, who did actually sign one of our pledge cards for 15 and said that he was for it. You would see him be favorable on a statewide level, and also you would start to see some of the sort of centrist DFL state legislators start to get backed up. If you had told me that we would get a 7-0 vote in St. Paul a year earlier, I would have said, you're crazy. Dan Bostrom will never vote for this. There'll be a couple of others that probably won't vote for it. And we got 7-0 because they were all backed up into a corner and had no choice. So,
I would like to.
If I could just add, Christy, how could you be so naive? We can never have a statewide $15 minimum wage because all of the restaurants will go to Wisconsin. So it's not possible. And you can just put that dream away.
Yes, Kara, please.
I would just add, and this may be stating the obvious, but in Minneapolis and St. Paul, you know, the councils are philosophically favorable to this kind of thing, right? These are progressive cities. So the challenge in moving to the suburbs is not just starting a campaign a couple years out and then getting it done, you know, and I'm sure you know this, right? But it is the long-term electoral organizing and community organizing to get those folks in place, you know, so that you can actually bring a policy to them that, and then go through the life of the campaign to get it passed. Yeah.
I appreciate that Kip mentioned Rochester, and I wonder, Rick, would you say a little bit about the kind of organizing that's going on in Rochester?
Sure. SEIU created a community affiliate membership program called CURE, Citizens United for Rochester Empowerment. And it's been active, I think, for about the last 2 years, basically working around the idea that the state has given Rochester and the Mayo Clinic an enormous amount of institutional power through this destination medical center setup that it's going to allow sort of Mayo to sort of try to transform Rochester into a world-class city so that people will want to go there to get their medical care and then have great opportunities around it. So we've been doing a lot of organizing around trying to get more affordable housing in Rochester, raising the minimum wage, and it goes, I don't have a lot more details other than it goes to the idea of trying to mobilize the community, but then give them an institutional hook to use that institutional leverage to get real concrete improvements.
And I would just add that, part of what's happening in the suburbs and what's happening in Rochester is the community demographics are changing very substantially. So there's a large Somali and other immigrant group presence in Rochester, and places like Bloomington and Lakeville and Apple Valley, or in Burnsville are increasingly, and we're seeing that. We're learning about that from teachers' unions in those communities who are talking about the diversity of the students they're working with. So I think that's one of the ways on the ground that politics may be changing in those communities as well. And for me, it also bears out what we're trying to do with the Eastside Freedom Library to connect the immigrant experiences with the labor movement and ways that will create dynamic relationships. And other comments, questions, please. And let me give you the mic again so that we can record you. And yep, great.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm from Beth. Nice job, everyone on the panel. That was a good segue from your last question, or from your last comment, I have two questions, really. One on social movements and one on the $15 an hour wage issue. On the social movement area, and immigrants in particular, do you see any way for the unions to be working to ally with some of the undocumented workers on issues around their working conditions, or on driver's license ID, or on sanctuary cities, or even on some of the immigration broader issues in terms of that community? On the $15 an hour wage issue, I got a war room question. What was your approach to the Koch brothers and ALEC efforts to do preemption at the state legislature, aside from just relying on the governor's veto? What was your strategy?
Thank you. Who wants to respond to either of Dave's questions? Jeff, please.
Just thinking about the undocumented immigrants, or immigrants in general. A lot of our labor contracts have immigration language that talks about someone being able to change their name without losing. So if they were previously undocumented and they're able to obtain their residency or whatever, they're able to change their name and not lose seniority, not lose their position, not lose their job. In Florida, I know that, our union is majority immigrants and majority women. And in Florida, for example, specifically at Disney World, we had 6 months for someone to go and arrange their paperwork and then be able to have their position and hold back, right? What was the other part to your question? Just in general, how do you...
Well, on specific issues like driver's license ID and so forth.
Yeah, and so I know that one of the organizers in the office that does a lot of community work, and there's a group in Minneapolis that's pushing forward for undocumented or driver's license for everyone. And so I think that, in the hotels, or in the airport food service, or in the other jobs that we represent, we fully understand that raising the wage in those jobs is going to raise the wage also in the non-union workplaces too, where the same immigrants are, and the family members of the immigrants that we have as members are working in those hotels and those other airport places and so on.
Yeah.
I think I'm okay. I was just kind
Put them together and it's probably going to blow up. So be
Yeah,
careful.
there you go.
Yeah.
So related to what you asked, the solidarity question is a really deep one, and it's not easy. I know when we were fighting for 15 at the airport, like I mentioned, we had petitions and saying, Metropolitan Airport Commissioners, give us 15 or whatever it was. And so in places like the Sky Chef Kitchen, which is almost all people of color, lots of immigrants, those petitions got signed really quickly. Amongst older, higher paid, white workers, mostly men, that work for Delta, they were making substantially more than a lot of the rest of the workforce. The first reaction of a lot of them was, you want to raise the minimum wage for those people? And it's a real thing, and you can't draw away from it. You have to move towards it and dive into it and have a deep discussion about why your interests are exactly the same as that Somali cabin cleaner that's working for half of what you work for. And we were successful. I mean, that's the important thing, is that you can, if you're willing to take the time and move into it, win these kind of questions around the question of immigration, the question of wages, the question of around Me Too with male workers. I mean, there's huge divisions on any number of different levels that the labor movement has to move into, and you won't win everybody, but you can certainly win the majority. If that wasn't true, then all of us here should go watch the Timberwolves and not waste our time with this kind of thing. But it is true that you can win, and that's part of the great thing about 15 and what we were able to do in Minneapolis and St. Paul is that you did have unions with lots of higher paid workers, along with some very low paid non-union workers operating side by side to win this. And I just got to take my hat off to the servers and the restaurant workers in St. Paul that really were the shock troops of winning in St. Paul, because they blunted the tip penalty question, even though there was lots of forces trying to win that, and that's another example of solidarity wins if you take the time to do it.
What was our strategy with the preemption?
I mean, there were a lot of mobilizations. Certainly relying on the governor's veto was a big part of that, I think. But there were, I mean, I wasn't really that involved with the preemption stuff, so I don't know what the inside story was, but Kera and Rick probably do.
We might not tell you all of it.
On preemption, it's a good question, and just two observations. One, I think the preemption debate actually worked in our favor a little bit because it got a lot of local elected officials to sort of just defend the idea of municipalities being able to do their own earned safe and sick time or their own 15, and that was like the first step to actually doing it. You know, a lot more of them were thinking about it. I would say the other thing to note, which was kind of a tell, which goes to the success of the social movements, when the Republicans moved it, they always sort of packaged it with a carrot. Like preemption was the bad thing, but I can't remember, like it was like, they were talking about like adding money for wage theft enforcement. I think there was some talk of like, we'll do statewide earned safe and sick time at a really low level, but it will preempt all those. But I just think it was telling that because of the success of the social movement, they didn't feel like they could just do say no. And so I think that plays to, and I think what they're afraid of is generating momentum and just sort of the always having another struggle.
Kera.
Oh,
Sure.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So I'll try to answer both questions. Probably not great responses to either, but in regards to preemption and work that was done with preemption, I can't speak to what all of the various NGOs were doing in terms of getting their members engaged, but I know that unions were aggressively communicating with their members. So we were running phone banks in St. Paul, and we were running door knocks in St. Paul, and we were out canvassing people during that spring, regularly on the phones with them in the evenings, and asking them to connect with their legislators and talk to them about the issue and why it mattered. And I would guess that a whole heck of a lot of other organizations were doing similar things, and then trying to turn folks out when it mattered at the Capitol, right, when big votes were happening. And in terms of the other issues that you've raised, I can't say that we're in a place where we have a lot of consensus, I'll say from the broad labor community on any one of those things, right? But I know that there are unions that are organizing in support of driver's licenses for everyone. I know that there are unions that are doing, and who've been doing sustained work around immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform for an awfully long time, right? I know United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1189 has it's the Hardman Avenue Worker Center, right? And so that's all about helping their members who are not citizens find a path to citizenship if that's something that they are interested in, right? And if they don't have the barriers to it. And I can't remember what the other campaign was that you mentioned. But I would say too, wage theft is one of these issues that building trades are doing a lot of organizing around. Healthcare unions are doing a lot of organizing around as well. And I think sometimes people think of, wage theft happens when, I'm not going to name the super hip bakery in Minneapolis that hired my niece to do some training overnights for a few weekends and then never paid her. But it happens, and it happens to all kinds of people.
Call them out, Kara. Tell us who it was.
It's all right. I'll tell you later if you're really curious.
Name those filthy animals.
But, the building trades are doing a lot of organizing around that. And realistically, I think it's building a lot of trust with migrant communities and immigrant communities as well, right? So it's good for everybody, right? If we can get that work done.
Great, thank you.
If I could just,
Yes, go ahead, Claire.
I just wanted to reminisce, Rick reminded me of one of the preemption packages was they were holding public employee pensions. In exchange for preemption, they were going to fund public employee pensions. My local and others, we deal exclusively in public employees, all AFSCME locals do. And I think that goes back to what we've been saying about solidarity.
Teachers unions.
Teachers unions, yeah. I mean, I think that they were hoping that some weaker unions would say, oh, okay, well, I guess we're not doing 15 anymore, like, we need our pensions. And I think that, I don't remember, but I think what we saw was that nobody batted an eye. It was like, no, you're not gonna do that. We'll get our pension funding and you're not gonna pass preemption. But it was definitely an attempt to break organized labor away from the social movement aspect of the fight for 15. And through our solidarity, we luckily failed.
Anyone else? Other questions? I want to just tell one story, pick up on the solidarity theme, and also how all of this is tied to democracy. And yesterday, a group of about 50 Mexican immigrants met here, and they are part of a national movement organizing to pressure the new government of Mexico to give Mexicans in specific communities where there are consulates the right to vote out whoever is running the consulate and vote in somebody else. And of course, part of what's happening on a broad bureaucratic level is the people running the consulates in different cities or people who were put in those jobs by the previous government of Mexico. But the idea that democracy is the answer to lack of government response to people's needs, it isn't that they have some abstract value for democracy. It's that people are not helping them get the papers they need. People are not helping them get aid to their families that they want to process. And so democracy is a way to get the bums out and to get people in. And I think that this, this vision of solidarity that panelists have been talking about tonight and ways that that's manifested, that actually I'll go pointy-headed academic for a second and say, that the origins of the word democracy is the Greek word for people. And that there was the democracy versus the aristocracy. And the democracy was the people. And that's the solidarity, I think, that folks have been talking about tonight. So thank you all for coming. if you have more questions or want to visit with each other or panelists, please do. We're not going to shut the lights and throw you out right away. In a little bit, but not right away. And thank you for coming. And if you haven't signed the guest book, sign the guest book. Give us your email. As I said, next month the theme will be the labor movement and healthcare reform. And I would also add Wednesday night this week, we are screening the new documentary about the Ford plant in St. Paul. And the filmmaker and the primary historian will be here. And then Thursday night, this young labor historian, Eric Loomis from Rhode Island, who's written a book called The History of America in 10 Strikes. Eric will be here with his book and in an event co-sponsored with Democratic Socialists of America. So there's a lot going on. And I would also add, because I see a candidate for city council here in Ward 6, Alexander Bourne, that next Wednesday night we will have a candidate forum here. There are 5 candidates for the Ward 6 city council seat, all 5 of them people of color. It's very exciting what's going on here in St. Paul. And so come back. 4?
One dropped out.
Oh. We'll
that.
find out afterwards. All right. Not you, though.
No.
Not you.
No.
All right. Great. Thank you. Can we show some love for the speaker?